The amphitheater of the Galactic Academy shimmered with refracted starlight, its tiers filled with scholars, officers, and diplomats from 23 species. At the center stood the renowned Cathari xenopsychologist, Scholar Vakar, her crystalline quills trembling with anticipation. Before her, alone at the lectern, waited Terran Cadet Arin Hale, posture straight, eyes steady. Vakar's voice carried through the chamber like a blade drawn across glass. "Human," she asked, "explain why your species refuses to break." The murmuring crowd stilled. Hale inhaled once, slow, deliberate. When he finally spoke, the hall leaned forward, sensing a truth none of them were prepared to hear. Outside the Academy's crystal dome, the galaxy was a braided ledger of treaties and grudges. Centuries of expansion had stitched Terran colonies into sectors long claimed by older empires. Resources that once seemed infinite, helium-3 veins, micro-machining asteroids seeded with rare alloys, had become leverage. Where maps overlapped, so did suspicion. The AI embargoes imposed after the Seven Rings incident had tightened every doctrine. Adaptive combat cores were illegal across 10 systems, forcing fleets back into manual tactics and human judgment. In that brittle environment, stories carried weight. A rumor could reroute a convoy or reassign an admiral. Dr. Vakar, the xenopsychologist who had convened the session, represented a discipline born of those fractures. Predictive sociology, a science that converted behavior into probabilities. Her field thrived on pattern and predictability, qualities humans notoriously resisted. She had spent 2 standard cycles compiling a dossier of Terran responses to catastrophe. Survival rates, improvisational engineering logs, and an unusual frequency of voluntary casualty rescue operations in hostile theaters. To Vakar, these were anomalies worth explaining, not virtues to be admired. On the political side, the Vakula Lignate had issued a notice weeks earlier. Increased patrols near the Rhea corridor and stricter salvage codes after a string of ambiguous distress signals. Dominion War Councils supplemented those notices with cold assessments of human expansion, economic aggression framed as resilience. Fleet captains logged encounters where Terran frigates ignored jurisdictional claims to render aid. That behavior, when filtered through adversarial doctrine, read less like mercy and more like opportunistic salvage. Within the Academy, delegates weren't impartial spectators. Ambassadors from the Dominion and a Lignate sat with arms folded, their faces unreadable. Military attachés watched for tactical implications. Ethicists whispered about cultural fitness and the morality of risk. Even among the younger scholars, there was a hunger for a tidy explanation that could be encoded into courses and simulations. Cadet Hale's presence in this arena was meant to supply that explanation. He had been chosen not for notoriety, but for the plain record of his unit. Dozens of rescues, engineered improvisations under duress, and a refusal to abandon civilians during withdrawal operations. The room expected a demonstration of technique or a recitation of doctrine. They did not expect history. The Academy's archived analyses of humanity were extensive, yet misleadingly shallow. Reports cataloged Terran physiology, denser musculature, adaptable biochemistry, high variance in psychological profiles, but none of them captured the underlying mechanism of human endurance. Alien scholars studied patterns. Terrans lived through disruptions. The Dominion's behavioral ministry classified humans as chaotic responders, creatures who adapted reactively rather than systematically. The Cathari scholars, including Vakar, argued that such volatility should logically impede long-term survival. Yet the data stubbornly contradicted this. Terran colonies flourished in marginal environments that other empires deemed untenable. Recent border conflicts only deepened the puzzle. In the Rhea corridor incident, 3 Terran ships survived a stellar flare that disabled half a Dominion escort fleet. In the Ashen Rift evacuation, human marines extracted survivors from a collapsing mining station while their own exfiltration window narrowed to seconds. These weren't victories of strength. They were victories of refusal to accept outcomes others considered inevitable. The Dominion circulated these accounts as warning signals. Terran analysts treated them as familiar stories. Vakar believed the key lay not in biology or tactics, but in psychology, some cultural inheritance humanity carried from its pre-space eras. Her lecture invitation to Cadet Hale was framed as academic discourse, but insiders knew its stakes were larger. If Terran resilience could be quantified, it could be predicted. If predicted, it could be managed. And if managed, the Dominion believed, Terran expansion might finally be contained. Representatives from neutral powers filled the side galleries, observing the experiment with cautious curiosity. The Rayleigh Consortium hoped human adaptability might translate into trade advantage. The Vacuole hoped it justified new containment protocols. Even the Terran delegation, seated with stony neutrality, understood that Hale's testimony could influence diplomatic posture for years. When Hale stepped into the central dais, the room expected a straightforward account. Training regimens, psychological conditioning, crisis simulations. Something that fit neatly into existing frameworks. But as he scanned the audience, Dominion strategists, Cathari scholars, Vacuole envoys, he understood the real question beneath Vakar's words. What makes your species so hard to defeat? The cadet inhaled slowly, preparing an answer none of them anticipated. From the Dominion military's viewpoint, human resilience was a statistical aberration, an outlier that disrupted otherwise stable combat predictions. Their tactical academies taught that morale decay, environmental degradation, and logistical pressure would break most species along predictable curves. Yet Terran units regularly held beyond those thresholds, sometimes reversing battles that Dominion analysts had already classified as lost. To them, this was not heroism, but a breach of probability, an uncomfortable reminder that their models were incomplete. The Cathari scholars approached the puzzle from a more analytical angle. Their species possessed a deep cultural reverence for equilibrium. Survival was maintained through adherence to structure and avoidance of unnecessary risk. When they studied Terran behavior, they saw contradiction. Humans embraced danger, improvised solutions, and tolerated levels of emotional volatility that would destabilize Cathari society. Vakar's research categorized this as adaptive irrationality, a term reflecting her belief that human resilience was not the result of method, but of impulse. Her goal in questioning Hale was to expose the limits of that impulse. The Vacuole alignate, ever pragmatic, interpreted human endurance through the lens of resource economics. Their simulations concluded that Terran resilience was a byproduct of scarcity. A civilization born on a world of fluctuating climates, geological instability, and predation. From this, they argued, humans evolved a survival mindset shaped by desperation rather than purpose. That assumption informed their containment strategies, blockades, trade constraints, and calculated diplomatic pressure intended to limit Terran influence before it expanded uncontrollably. Ethicists from the Rayleigh Consortium held an entirely different concern. They believed Terran resilience bordered on self-destructive altruism. Reports of humans risking their own survival to rescue strangers, sometimes enemy combatants, challenged Rayleigh principles of calculated benevolence. To them, the Terran drive to protect others appeared noble but dangerously unpredictable, capable of undermining ceasefires or escalating conflicts unintentionally. Even neutral observers carried their own biases. Some saw humans as admirable, others as reckless. Many believed Terran technological achievements, modular starships, redundancy-heavy life support, intuitive AI triage systems were overcompensations for inherent fragility. If humans built machines that could survive anything, it was assumed they must fear the alternative. All these interpretations shared one flaw. Each tried to fit humanity into a framework built by non-human logic. They measured resilience in terms of biology, tactics, or policy, never considering that the real foundation might lie in something less tangible. Something born not from strength, but from memory. As Hale stood before them, these assumptions pressed against him like invisible walls, waiting to be validated or shattered. From the Terran military's perspective, resilience was neither anomaly nor miracle. It was doctrine shaped by lived experience. Human forces trained under the assumption that systems fail, plans unravel, and environments shift without warning. Their simulations emphasized failure recovery rather than flawless execution. A Terran squad might lose communications, navigation, or atmospheric control, yet the expectation remained. Continue the mission, preserve life, extract survivors. To Dominion strategists, this looked like reckless defiance. To Terrans, it was preparation for reality. Culturally, humans carried a legacy that no alien archive fully captured. Their early history was a mosaic of extinctions narrowly avoided. Ice ages endured, pandemics survived, volcanic winters outlasted. Civilization had risen repeatedly from conditions that would have extinguished more fragile species. Over millennia, this forged a psychological imprint. Survival was not merely possible, it was necessary. Children grew up hearing stories not of empire, but of endurance. Generations internalized the belief that catastrophe was not an ending, but a beginning point from which one rebuilt. Technologically, Terran engineering reflected this ethos. Human ships prioritized redundancy over elegance. Backups for backups, modular systems designed to be torn apart and reassembled mid-crisis. Rescue capsules doubled as mobile triage units. Exosuits carried survival tools woven into their joints. AIs were restricted from autonomous warfare, but empowered to preserve life at all costs. These design choices confused alien analysts, who interpreted them as evidence of paranoia. In truth, they were the product of a civilization that assumed chaos was inevitable and survivable. Ethically, humans occupied a moral landscape unfamiliar to many species. Their resilience extended not just to themselves, but outward, toward others. Terran rescue logs overflowed with incidents of soldiers refusing evacuation until civilians or enemy combatants were brought to safety. This behavior baffled the Rayleigh and unsettled the Dominion. To them, risking one's life for strangers destabilized chain of command and introduced emotional variables into strategic planning. But for humans, such acts were integral to identity. Resilience meant retaining humanity even when survival was uncertain. Leadership, too, played a role. Terran commanders were taught to empower initiative. A private could improvise a solution that a captain would later formalize. This decentralized problem-solving created a resilience network that no alien hierarchy could replicate. Where others waited for orders, humans acted. Cadet Hale understood all these facets, but he also sensed that none of them would answer Vakar's true question. Resilience was not born in training halls or engineering bays. It was born in the quiet spaces between tragedies, in the human capacity to endure loss, to rebuild hope, and to choose meaning even when reason offered none. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, he reached not for doctrine but for memory. Cadet Arin Hale did not begin with tactics, nor with the doctrines the audience expected to hear. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the vaulted crystalline ceiling, where the starlight fractured into 1,000 quiet reflections, and spoke with a softness that carried farther than any amplified declaration. "You ask why we don't break," he began, "but that's not the right question. The truth is we do break, often." A ripple of confusion passed through the alien scholars, but Hale continued before interruption could find him. "Our resilience isn't the absence of breaking. It's what comes after." He described a Terran colony disaster, details classified until now, when a tectonic failure on the frontier world Epsilon Mora fractured the surface into cascading rifts. Entire districts fell into molten chasms, communication collapsed in minutes. Hale had been 12 years old. His academy file only mentioned that he was a survivor. It did not record what he witnessed. He recounted families building makeshift shelters from heat-warped plating, teachers organizing children into hand-cranked ventilation lines, engineers linking shattered power cells into life support rigs salvaged from debris. With every sentence, the hall grew quieter. The Dominion analysts listened with stiffened mandibles. The Cathari leaned in despite themselves. "We weren't waiting for rescue," he said. "We became it." He described carrying water across ash fields to strangers he'd never met. He described watching adults amputate their own escape routes to reroute oxygen into collapsed corridors holding survivors. He described grief, raw, immediate, overwhelming, but always followed by motion. Someone digging, someone searching, someone refusing to let the dead define the living. "That's why we don't stay broken," Hale said, voice steady now. "Because even a child knows the rule. If someone is still breathing, you don't stop." Data overlays, previously abstract in Dominion reports, suddenly acquired context. Survival rates, improvised structures, impossible endurance. Numbers now had faces. Hale let the silence return. The audience felt, not understood, but felt, the weight behind his resilience, and the room sensed that this was only the beginning of the revelation. Scholar Vakar had entered the session believing she would expose the myth of Terran resilience. Instead, she found her frameworks dissolving beneath Hale's words. The chamber's data scribes displayed survival metrics alongside the cadet's account, and suddenly patterns the Dominion had labeled anomalies, aligned with harrowing clarity. What they had treated as tactical unpredictability was something far older and far more deliberate, a cultural mandate to rebuild even while bleeding. Vakar stepped closer, her crystalline quills dimming with uncertainty. "You imply resilience is not innate," she said, "but manufactured through suffering." Hale shook his head. "Not manufactured, remembered." The distinction struck the hall like a pressure wave. The Rayleigh ethicists exchanged glances. The Vakul delegation turned to their analysts, whispering recalculations. Dominion strategists rapidly adjusted projections on their slates, realizing their threat models had missed a foundational variable. Humans didn't endure because they were strong. They endured because, across thousands of years, they had built a civilization on top of broken foundations and refused to let the fractures define them. Hale continued. "Our species learned survival the hard way. Every time our world tried to kill us, we rebuilt. Every time we lost people, we carried them with us. Not in grief alone, in purpose. We are resilient because we cannot bear the idea that suffering is meaningless." The chamber fell utterly silent. Vakar, visibly shaken, asked the question no one else dared. "And what does that make you in conflict?" Hale's answer was calm, almost sorrowful. "It makes us terrifying, because when others fight to win, humans fight to protect what must not be lost." The statement cracked through the assembly like a seismic fault. Battles, ceasefire collapses, and improbable Terran victories suddenly made sense. Humanity did not resist annihilation because it loved war. It resisted because, in its bones, it refused to accept that any life, human or alien, should be surrendered to despair. This was the revelation the tribunal had not anticipated. A doctrine not of conquest, but of endurance shaped by memory, grief, and a refusal to let the universe stay broken. The hall wasn't just listening anymore. It was understanding. The chamber remained frozen long after Hale's final words faded. Scholars who had arrived prepared to dissect human psychology now found themselves confronting the limits of their own. Dominion tacticians scrolled through their predictive models, discovering abrupt inconsistencies. Every scenario in which Terrans had endured beyond expected thresholds now carried a new interpretation. Not defiance, but duty. What had once looked like chaos now resembled conviction. The Vakul delegation quietly exchanged encrypted notes, their containment doctrines unraveling. If Terrans fought not for dominance but for meaning, then blockades and coercive diplomacy would never suppress their expansion. The Rayleigh ethicists, visibly moved, drafted an immediate recommendation to their council. Revise humanitarian categorization of Terrans from reactive altruists to moral stabilizers, a classification reserved for species whose ethical conduct influences interstellar policy. Vakar, shaken yet composed, submitted an urgent addendum to the Academy's behavioral archive. Human resilience is a cultural constant, not a tactical variable. Several scholars protested, but the evidence was already spreading across intranet channels, annotated by Hale's testimony and cross-referenced with decades of misinterpreted field data. Diplomats filed preliminary communiques to their governments. Some feared the implications, others recognized opportunity. Understanding Terran resilience meant recalibrating alliances, doctrines, and crisis protocols. Within hours, academic debate spilled into political strategy. And in the center of it all, Cadet Hale stood silent, unaware that his words had already begun reshaping the galaxy's assumptions about the species he represented. In the days that followed, Hale's testimony radiated through the interstellar networks like a controlled detonation, quiet in delivery, devastating in effect. The Dominion's Defense Ministry convened an emergency review of all human-related threat projections. Entire predictive branches were suspended pending recalibration. Their conclusion, delivered in a terse communique, stated, "Terran endurance stems from cultural imperatives. Models treating it as anomaly are invalid." The Vakul Elignate adopted a more cautious stance, issuing new guidelines for frontier engagements. Avoid misinterpreting Terran rescue actions as territorial breaches. Their analysts acknowledged that what appeared to be strategic overreach often originated from a humanitarian impulse their doctrines had never accounted for. Academic institutions across multiple species updated their xenopsychology curricula. Hale's explanation was transcribed into standard instructional modules, paired with holo-recordings of historical Terran disasters and recoveries. Students debated whether resilience driven by memory was replicable or uniquely human. Scholars argued, councils legislated, and fleet commanders rewrote protocols, each responding to the realization that humanity's strength lay not in biology or technology, but in its refusal to surrender meaning. For the Terran Federation, the aftermath carried a quieter pride. Hale received no medals. His account had been personal, not performative, but he became a symbol of clarity in a galaxy clouded by misinterpretation. Terran academies began teaching his testimony as a reminder that resilience was not an inheritance, but a responsibility. Across the political and academic spectrum, one conclusion settled with growing certainty. Understanding humanity required understanding the stories it carried, and the wounds it refused to forget long after the amphitheater emptied, and the last murmurs dissolved into quiet corridors. The echoes of Cadet Hale's words remained suspended in the crystalline air of the academy. They lingered the way seismic aftershocks do, subtle at first, then reshaping the landscape entirely. For years, scholars had treated human resilience as a statistical deviation, something to be graphed and corrected. Yet Hale had revealed it as something far deeper. Not a tactic, not an instinct, but a philosophy shaped by millennia of refusing to let calamity decide the fate of their kind. In the aftermath, reflection spread like a slow tide across institutions and empires. The Dominion's xenopsychologists reevaluated their foundational assumptions. They had long defined survival as the ability to avoid destruction. Humanity challenged that belief by asserting something more profound. Survival was the meaning made after destruction. Dominion archives began collecting human testimonies, survivors of catastrophes, volunteers from disaster zones, children who grew up in the shadow of collapsed infrastructure, and discovered a recurring theme. Humans did not merely adapt to hardship, they integrated it, turning trauma into a compass for future action. For the Vacuole, a species whose history relied on strict risk aversion, Hale's revelation introduced an unsettling paradox. If humans crafted identity from adversity, then conflict with them could not be resolved through deterrence alone. The Vacuole Diplomatic Corps quietly assembled a new think tank dedicated to understanding Terran ethical momentum. The idea that once humans committed to protecting life, whether their own or others, they could not easily be dissuaded. This realization carried both comfort and caution. Academic circles throughout the galaxy found themselves grappling with a philosophical shift. The Cathari, who had built their intellectual traditions on equilibrium, struggled with the notion that resilience could emerge from imbalance. Yet Vakar herself, after initial resistance, acknowledged the profound simplicity in Hale's answer. Humans broke, but they never stayed broken. It was a concept that violated no physical laws, yet none of their models had accounted for it. The Academy began revising course structures to include emotional resilience, communal memory, and cultural continuity as measurable forces in interstellar development. Within the Terran Federation, the impact took a quieter form. Hale's account, though personal, resonated with civilians and soldiers alike. It reminded them of a truth often overshadowed by their expanding frontier, that their strength was not defined by conquest or superiority, but by connection, to each other, to their histories, to the belief that suffering carries meaning when transformed into protection. Terran philosophers noted an uptick in enrollment for courses on moral responsibility and communal identity. Cadets training for fleet service were reminded that resilience wasn't simply a tool for survival. It was a choice renewed daily. Diplomatically, Hale's testimony softened old narratives. Empires that once viewed humans with suspicion began to approach Terran alliances with a new lens, not because they believed humanity harmless, but because they understood the moral architecture behind Terran behavior. In a galaxy often governed by cold calculus, there was something disarming in a species that fought not for dominance, but to preserve significance in the universe. In the end, the moment between Vakar and Hale transcended the lecture hall. It became a reference point for scholars, strategists, diplomats, and civilians seeking to understand the unpredictable species from the blue planet. And as generations passed, the question Hale answered endured, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. For if resilience was a memory, then every human carried the past not as a burden, but as a promise. And in that quiet chamber illuminated by fractured starlight, the galaxy finally understood why humanity, despite every scar, every loss, every shattering, refused to break.